Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This is a episode in our series on Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, a famous individual. I'll give you a little bio in a minute. And this is episode 8. So I did episodes 1 through 7 back in 2022 at the very beginning of the launch of the channel. So if you want to go back, I'll put a description. In the description, I'll put a link to those 7 episodes in my Airtable. Anyway, the title of this episode is Jeremy Bentham claims there's an imbalance towards Paul over Jesus in the church today, in the church of his era, which has persisted, I believe, is obvious, and Gastrell's Christian Institutes. And he was looking at the 1808 version, but I could only find the 1747. So we're going to look at the 1747 version today. So we will test his claim, whether indeed you can see Paul is paid attention to way above anything Jesus says. And how far back this goes is actually in the post King James era, 1747, 1808. It's the same thing, I'm sure, in 1808 that Jeremy Bentham was facing. And the book we're going to be looking at in a few minutes is Francis Gastrell's book called The Christian Institutes, the 1747 edition. Okay, let's begin. First, a reminder of who is Jeremy Bentham. He was born in 1747, died in 1832. He was an English philosopher, jurist, and social reformer. He was regarded as the founder of modern utilitarianism. I'll give you a little synopsis of that in a second. So we asked for a biography of him, and here's what it reads. Jeremy Bentham, 1748-1832, was a political theorist and reformer who advocated for individual rights, democratic governance, and the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. That's utilitarianism. So you always seek the benefit of the most people from an action. He said he fought for freedom of expression. Bentham believed that freedom of expression, especially freedom of the press, was a protection against despotism. He also believed in equal rights for women. Bentham advocated for equal rights for women. He also believed in the separation of church and state. Bentham advocated for this separation of church and state. He also believed there was an equal say for all citizens. Bentham believed that all citizens should have an equal say in decisions that affect their lives. So universal suffrage, in other words. And now he's the author of the book, Not Paul, but Jesus. And he comes down in favor of Jesus and says Paul has an undue influence and should not be accepted as what he's saying if you use juridical, meaning legal standards of proof. And we'll look at that later. He wrote under a pseudonym of Gamaliel Smith because he was told it would be dangerous to do anything else. But eventually he, was acknowledged that he was the writer. And his name is written here by the librarian, Jeremy Bentham. You could just see there by hand. So he's acknowledged as the actual author of this work. Let's continue. Now, in this book, he begins with something called the plan of the work. You could call it the preface. And he says this about where he's going and what he's going to be basically saying. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here so you can see. He's going to give a footnote at the end of this. See this footnote here, this asterisk? Well, it's going to tell you that what he's known as a symptom is that for making the requisite separation between Jesus and Paul, between the two religions of Jesus and the religion of Paul, an instrument alike commodious and unexceptional has, for these many years, though assuredly not with any such view, been presented to all hands by Dr. Gastrell, an English and Church of England bishop, namely in well-known work instituted the Christian Institutes, the date of 14th AD edition, 1808. He's saying there is these two different religions can be seen by looking at this book and seeing how Jesus is being pushed aside on all these teachings, and it's just Paul, even though Jesus has direct teachings on that same subject, just that he's ignored. He says this. It is composed of a collection of points of faith and morality, and under each are quoted the several texts in the New Testament, which are regarded by the author as affording grounds for the positions indicated. If then anywhere in his composition of the ground, passages one or more from this or that epistle of Paul are employed, unaccompanied with any passage extracted from any one of the four Gospels, the reader may, without much danger or error, venture to conclude that it is to the religion of Paul alone that the point of doctrine thus supported appertains, and not to the religion of Jesus. So he's saying wherever you see that Jesus is ignored, completely written out of the answer, is that basically this is somebody who believes in the religion of Paul alone. And he's basically being critical of that. He believes Jesus is who should be listened to, not Paul. As to any of the epistles which bear the name of any of the real apostles of Jesus, see, he doesn't believe he's a true apostle. And we've already told you, Ambrose in 350 AD approximately wrote there that the 12 apostles had to determine Paul as a false apostle due to his views on Sabbath. See, so there was this actual knowledge of what happened in that, and that's on commentary on the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 9 verse 2. So we've have episode after episode on that passage and translated from Latin and verified it's in every version of the Latin of that text of Ambrose. It just somehow slipped by the censors that they didn't want that. Anyway, let's continue. As to any of the epistles which bear the name of any of the real apostles of Jesus, a corresponding question may perhaps be here suggesting itself. But with regard to the design of the present work, scarcely will they be found relevant. For when compared with the sayings of Jesus as repeated in the four Gospels, scarcely will they be found exhibiting any additional points of doctrine, never pregnant with any of those dissensions which from the writings of Paul have issued in such disastrous abundance. So basically he's saying is when you read Jesus, it's just plain and clear, and there's no real dissent that these are good principles. But when you get to Paul, you have all these conflicting views because there's a lot of horrific statements in Paul. Women can't speak in church. They have to ask their husbands the questions at home. They can't communicate with anyone about this at church about a question. That's unbelievable. The pastor doesn't even have authority to give an answer to the wife. The wife has to go home and ask the husband. That's outrageous, right? But that's the slavery he created, and that's not in the Bible, by the way. He would say that was that was the law in the law. It's not in the law. There's nothing like that in the law. It's just preposterous stuff. All right, so I just want to show you an overview of Gastrell's work that he's relying upon to say this is where you can see differences between the two, the religion of Jesus and the religion of Paul. This is the title page, London, 1747 down here. Here are the contents. You can see they're basically all laid out, and it goes on and on. The fall of man, redemption, salvation, Jesus Christ, the kingdom of the church, blah. Okay, duty of man to God, duty of man to one another, the duty of man towards himself, concerning perfection of holiness, repentance, rewards, and punishment. So there's lots of topics here to look at. But I decided to take one where I know that Jesus and Paul completely contradict, and that's on how you should treat your ministers. Do you pay them or do you not pay them? Jesus is very clear. If you're not aware, they're completely contradictory messages. So we're going to look at that right now. All right, so we're going to now take a topic which there is a clear contradiction between Paul and Jesus. And we're going to look at the duty of Christian believers towards their ministers. And now what I'm going to tell you is I've read the whole chapter, and the contrary message of Jesus is never even quoted or cited. This is typical of what you see in church today. You'll be only told what Paul teaches you, but not what Jesus teaches. And this is where it goes to the heart of the bias of the person speaking to you, because the person speaking to you is a bishop. And the bishops are not allowed money to be charged to the people. You can't ask for money from the congregants to teach you the Bible. And it's definitely prohibited by Jesus Christ. Okay, and we'll get into that in a second. But this is never mentioned because Paul says you can get it using a statement from the law about oxen, which the law, Paul said, was dead and gone, but not when he wants money. He's going to actually construe it to mean it altogether never meant what it said on its face about letting the oxen tread out to eat the grain as it's treading it out. No, that's not about them. It's altogether about us, that we get a right to money from you congregants. So we're going to get into that now. But so that's why I picked this, because this is such a blatant contradiction, and it's such an obvious example of how the Protestant church even is as corrupt as the Roman Catholic in this respect of hiding the fact that Paul contradicts Jesus by not telling you what Jesus says at all. So let me just read you what Jesus says. Okay, and we're using the Mouncy reverse interlinear. And the reason why is if you know Greek at all, you can actually double check what you're reading as I read it to you. In other words, if there's any hanky-panky by Mr. Mouncy, which there isn't here, you would be able to spot it. As you go, proclaim the message saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So they're giving the gospel message. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, drive out demons. Freely you received, freely give. So what are they doing? They're proclaiming the gospel message, and they're doing ministration to healing and health and driving out demons and so on, right? Freely you received. So they got the gospel free from Jesus, right? Did he charge them to listen to him? No. Did he ask for money from them in order to get his message to them? No. So freely they received, freely they must give. So they're not allowed to ask for any money from the people they're preaching to. There's a good reason for that. It's called audience capture. You will be corrupted by the audience. They'll dumb you down. They'll want to hear lies. That's also in Isaiah. We'll get to this later. Let's go next. It continues. Now, this is interesting. 9. Do not take gold or silver or copper in your money belts. So don't bother bringing any money when you go out on mission trips, or a bag for your journey, or for 2 tunics or sandals of the staff. Now, I would say this goes for life in general. If you want to be just in your daily walk, whatever you're doing, you just give the gospel and you never ask anyone for money in return, or, I need money. Can you help me in my ministry? No, you're not allowed to do that. Jesus said, nope. Now, what does he allow? That's what's interesting. Verse 10. Or bag for your journey, or 2 tunics, or sandals, or staff, for the worker deserves his keep. Now, this is an expression that is used in Jewish religion, in the law, about a worker is worthy of his wage, and actually means exactly what that means. If you're working in someone's house, you are allowed to take room and board. Travelers through town or hired workers in any respect always had a right to pay. That means you couldn't take advantage of people. You had to, if you were in their home, you were supposed to do services for them in return for the generosity they gave you. But if you stayed more than 2 or 3 days, you became a hired worker. Therefore, you now should be compensated. And so, worker is worthy of his wage. And we'll get into that in a little more depth in a second. Verse 11, in whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy and stay there until you leave. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your message, so if somebody will not even want to let you in their home because they're just being rude, having nothing to do with your message, they haven't even heard it. So this is an obligation that any Jewish person had in that era who was obedient to God's law. You would allow the person, the itinerant traveler, into your home for at least 1 or 2 days. And then if they created a relationship of wanting to serve more than just to compensate you for your allowance them to be there, you would end up having to owe them a wage, and that was obligatory. So hospitality could lead to food and water and room and board for a period of time. And when the person would end up working for you, you'd have to pay them, even though they started out as a guest. Okay, and it's mandated. So if anyone will not receive you, so that's not a person who didn't even hear a message, just didn't want you to come in the house or listen to your message. Now that's different. That's somebody who doesn't want to hear your message. Either you offered it at the door, or they heard you earlier and they just don't want you to come in because they don't want to hear what you have to say. He says, leave that house and that town, shake off the dust from your feet. So but those are 2 options, and it clearly shows, as scholars are going to show you, I'm going to read some of his discussion, that this means what Jesus allowed is you could be a worker worthy of his wage by going to someone, taking advantage of the law of hospitality and being taken in. Then eventually, over a couple of days after that, you have to get paid if you're going to keep working and cleaning out the garbage and cleaning out the pig stalls, bringing in the crops and so on. So you became a hired worker. And there's many references to hired workers have to be given a compensation for their time. All right, so now I want to show you, I'm going to read the synopsis to you that I have from an article that I wrote, and this is about the law of hospitality from Leviticus 25, verse 6. We all know Jesus taught the apostles that they preach and teach to lay no cost on anyone listening, for freely you received, freely you must give. Matthew 10, verse 8. Jesus, in the next few verses, explained the way an evangelist can obtain support is to follow the Mosaic law on hospitality. Go into a town and ask for a room to stay in another's home and offer household services. If you do exceptionally much, the homeowner has a duty to pay you a wage. The worker is worthy of his wage. The law of hospitality, Leviticus 25:6, and other passages, by the way. And where do you find this information provided in great detail is James Grimshaw, The Methane Community and the World, an analysis of Matthew Food Exchange. It was written in 2008. He explains in 104, page 104, the description of money, clothes, and accessories that one is to avoid taking in verses 9 to 10 of Matthew 10 ensures that the disciples were to look and act like guests with a concern about where to stay in order to receive food and lodging. So that's what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about don't bring your accessories or all these other things. You don't need them. You don't need your money bags. Just plan on staying at someone's home. By inquiring, entering the house, and working for its food, the community has become more active and mobile in the participation of food exchange. As the community enters the city or village and prepares to find a place to stay for food and lodging, it is to inquire who is worthy, that is, who will host them. Not who has heard the message and believes, no, who will host them, who's going to be obedient to this law of hospitality. The community does not stop at inquiring, however, and enters the house and works for its food. So the aim is to find a way to get into the house, be acceptable, and that means you have to offer an exchange, work for room and board over an extended period of time. A worker enters the house of another in chapter 10, verses 5 to 11. The community then understands the food exchange to involve a labor in another person's home. That's 10:10. The community works for its food as sojourners and laborers. And then he goes further, page 105, laborer. The shift in the image of the community from the 12 to laborers further supports the view that the community is in position of need and is seeking interaction. The community is still active in seeking, but is in a dependent position. The laborer can be translated as a worker, but a better translation for this study is a laborer or day laborer. The use in Matthew 20, and perhaps the use in Matthew 9, corresponds with the way many scholars describe day laborers in the first century. Those who worked for minimal wages, did not have a permanent job, were lower in status than peasant farmers and tenants, and struggled for survival from day to day. All right, so in other words, you were making a fair trade of your labor and time in order for the food and compensation. You weren't saying, I've just given you the gospel. Isn't this a treasure? Pay me. I'm God told us the oxen are allowed to tread out the grain and you can't muzzle the oxen. And that verse has nothing to do with oxen. It has all to do with me, and you need to give me money. No, you can't talk like that. That's totally wrong, and it's unbiblical besides. Let's continue. The image of the laborer in 10:10 switches the power difference between those sent out by Jesus and those to whom they are sent. Instead of the Matthean community sent out to act upon the lost sheep, to proclaim and heal, the community is now in need of hospitality to be acted upon from those in the house. So what he's emphasizing here is the fact that you have to go into a house to be in this position of being taken care of. He's saying, obviously, you have to offer hospitality. You have to offer your services in return for hospitality. The labor image is one who does indeed work and is active, but also one who needs daily food, a dependent position. Verses 9 to 10 makes sense then as introducing verse 11 to 15 on hospitality rather than concluding verses 5 to 8 on mission. So it's not the mission anymore of just traveling. It's simply when you have to rest, you have to go into a place of someone else's home. They're not outside homeless. They're going to take advantage of the law of hospitality in the area of Judea, where the people were already prepared to allow and open their homes, but in return, you had to provide services to make up for that. And after a couple of days, you had to now be paid by the person who let you in if they let you stay further. And so you have to offer that labor. I'll stay here and I'll, but I want to get paid for it. And they have to make a decision, and that's what you want. But you would get a minimum wage because you're not in a very strong position to negotiate for a lot of money in that instance. But you're not going to ever trade your preaching in order to get money. Jesus says, freely you received, freely you must give. Matthew 10, verses 11 to 13 describes the process of finding a house in which to stay. The criterion is whether a house is worthy or not. It is only in verse 14 that the audience is told that the criterion expands to whether or not a house receives you or listens to your words. So that receiving, he's going to emphasize later, is different from listening. So he's saying Jesus said, listen, or let's take a look at that verse here. If anyone will not receive you or listen to your message, means that person had two different ways they could have gone. They could have heard your message and rejected it, or they could just simply have not received you into the house. Flat out, you came to the door, says, I'd like to stay here. Can I stay like any other itinerant person? And they said no. In either case, you have this obligation, if they accepted you in, to take and follow the rules of hospitality, where you would get a couple of days for free and then after that, you've got to now do some work and get paid, or else you're going to be asked to leave. So this is the standard tradition of that era. Let me go back here. So he describes the process in Matthew 10, 11, and 13 of finding a house in which to stay. The criterion is whether a house is worthy. It is only in verse 14 that you are told that the criterion expands to whether or not the house receives you or listens to your words. The use of worthy, receives you, or listen to your words all point to the theme of hospitality. In other words, an exchange. My labor in your house, taking care of the pigs, cleaning out the yard, gathering the crops. After a couple of days, you're going to owe me. You have to start paying me. And that's just the way the law of hospitality works. The worker is worthy of his wage at that point. It has nothing to do with preaching and getting money. Absolutely the opposite. Jesus already said you can't do that. Freely you received, freely you must give. In its use in 10:10, the laborer is worthy of his food. However, the meaning shifts to the realm of hospitality. Worthiness depends upon the rules of hospitality for both guest and host. The guest is worthy if he has fulfilled his part of the guest-host relationship, which in part is to work as a laborer in the household. So this is a standard operating procedure. And because we're dumb Gentiles, we don't know any of this stuff. We don't understand what the law and the prophets are talking about hired laborers and sojourners and all these things. And we just are being exploited by people who don't tell us what Jesus teaches and what he means by freely you give, freely you receive, freely you must give. That means you cannot take money. The exact opposite is going to be taught by Paul, as we'll see. So let's take a look at that. This is the verse that Gastrell is going to quote and never mention anything about Jesus said how you have to be treated. You have to treat the persons you are seeking to lead to Christ. Okay, you have to not ask for money. That's just flat out how it is. And so the minister is not treated to money and wealth and income and houses and all that for in return for the gospel, because they will be what do you think is the danger of that? If you had that happens, you will be captured by your audience. They can direct and manipulate you to whatever end they want. But Paul's going to teach the opposite. You should demand money. In fact, you can insist upon it because the law of God, the law of Moses, which supposedly Paul says in every other context is dead and gone. Here he's going to say, no, there's a verse I can cite and tell you based on this. And I'm going to do a midrashic interpretation that has no basis in fact, that says this oxen passage is where you have to let the oxen tread out, eat from the grain it's treading out. And you can't muzzle it with a muzzle, so it can't eat it. And he's going to say this is altogether about us. So this is where it is, page 245, but nothing about Jesus in Matthew 10, 8 to 10. Not at all. Let me just read you here from this is a clearer text in this old font over here. It says this in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 9 to 10. For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? That's a rhetorical question, meaning no. Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? He's going to answer the question. For our sakes, no doubt. No doubt. He knows that God doesn't care about oxen. He cares about us. It's all together. It's not even an iota about the oxen. It's only about us. This is what Jesus says. You make up traditions. You extrapolate things that are impossible in the text to create your own traditions and do away with the word of God. The word of Jesus that freely you receive, freely you must give is being erased right here because Paul doesn't even have a clue what Jesus teaches. For our sakes, no doubt this is written that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be a partaker of his hope. Verse 11, if we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? He's now rhetorically asking you, of course it's not too much. You can deal with it. You've got some cash on your hands. Verse 12, if others have the right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? Is this biblical reasoning? He's arguing with you to try to get money from you. This is not going to say. Verse 14, in the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. Absolutely the opposite. He said, you're not to get your living from the gospel. You're supposed to get your living by going to their homes. And that's how you get, and doing services there. That's how you get survive. You don't survive by begging for money in order to preach. That's ridiculous. No, that's not how it works. Okay. Now, if you did some extraordinary services to that person, that's what Jesus says. That's when you're allowed to get money, but nothing else. If you're doing something that's beyond just teaching and preaching, you are entitled to compensation, or you could ask for compensation, but you're not ever allowed to ask for in return for preaching. But Paul teaches the opposite, my friends, the opposite. 1 Corinthians 9, verses 11, 12, and 14. So I want to show you what Apostle John, who heard those words of Jesus in Matthew, right? He's going to tell you, no, you never take money from even the Gentiles at all. Because what? Listen to this. Because for his name's sake, they went forth taking nothing of the Gentiles. These were the missionaries that the church had sent out, and they sent them out to the Gentiles, but they were to take no money from them. Why is that? Because again, audience capture. You don't want to be audience capture. That's 3 John verse 7. And just a digression, God, Yahweh, explains through the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 30 verses 9 to 10 that people don't want to hear a message that has any cost to it. So that's why they're going to try to audience capture people who become an institution of being their teachers and preachers. If you ask money and you say, I'm dependent on you for money to continue preaching free of charge, then they're going to start the audience is going to start capturing you and telling you what they want to hear. And listen to what God says happens. Verse 9, this is a rebellious people, lying children. Children will not hear the law of the Lord. So the first thing, law of Yahweh, the first thing that's going to go is going to say, we don't want to hear any more about this law stuff. Give us some stuff that's much easier than that. Who says to the seers, do not see, and to the prophets, do not prophesy to us right things. They're not going to want to hear the true words of Jesus. They're going to want to hear the words of somebody who says there's nothing to do. It's just faith alone. Don't worry about anything. And that's exactly what the last verse says. Speak to us of smooth things, easy things. Prophesy to us deceits. Tell us lies. That's what ends up happening. Then that audience will capture the person. And then the next audience that comes along doesn't know. They see this whole structure, and you're supposed to give money to the pastors and all this stuff. And they don't realize it's all been set up to teach you smooth things that will lead you to feel there's no big deal. Christianity is an easy thing. It's not a difficult way. It's easy peasy. And I'll just keep paying my money and make them tell me what I want to hear. Because you'll realize that you subconsciously want to hear a message that's easy and has no burdens. That's exactly what you've got Christianity today. It's like a nothing burger church. There's no obligations at all. And Jesus is the exact opposite. And your pastors are completely violating the words of Jesus in Matthew 10, verses 8 to 10. All right. So now that you know I've picked a topic that there's a complete contradiction between Jesus and Paul, and Jesus' words have not been referenced at all in any of this passage, several pages of this book, that is unforgivable. How can you do that? And that's how you should know. You shouldn't even ever. You should know yourself not to pay anyone who's trying to preach to you, and in return for their preaching, pay money. It's never should be done. Nobody should even solicit it for preaching. Okay, I'm going to shut down my channel unless you send me money. No, or I'm going to go out of business running this channel. No, that is wrong. That is unethical. That's violative of Jesus' commands. Now, let me show you. So I went to several pages, and I counted up how many times Paul is quoted or cited in versus Jesus. And so here's the topic: the duty of Christian believers towards their ministers. This is where the oxen passage was cited earlier by this gentleman in this context. 5 times in this passage over here, Paul is quoted, and 0 Jesus. 5-0. Next, same thing happens again. The next page, 9 times, page 242, 9 times for Paul, 1 for Jesus. So now we're at 14 for Paul, 1 for Jesus. Next, this is going to be 6 for Paul, 4 for Jesus. Same premises here, page 243. 20 times for Paul total, 5 for Jesus so far. Next page, 245. There's 3 more for Paul, 0 for Jesus. It's 23 for Paul and 5 for Jesus. Now, that is sickening, isn't it? But that is standard operating procedure. If you don't believe me, go to your own church and just sit there and write down every time Jesus is quoted versus every time that Paul's quoted with a tally mark, little line down. And then when you have 5, you take the 4 lines down and you just cross it out, and you've got 5 total tally marks, and you keep going, and you'll have 13 times for Paul for every one of Jesus. That was my statistics that I kept for 5 years when I was attending Protestant churches after I'd found this message was of Jesus' words only. Now, I want to read you one last thing, and I'm going to let you go. Macarius Magnus in his Apocryticus, book 3, chapters 30 and paragraph 36, and this is written around 300 AD. Listen to how cogent he is about telling you, independently of these statistics, that why you should just immediately go, wow, Paul cannot be from God. That Paul, dissembles the gospel, basically misrepresents the true gospel for the sake of vainglory, for his own good, for his own benefits, to vaunt himself, and the law for the sake of covenances. So he dissembles the gospel and he dissembles the law. Basically, he misrepresents it for the sake of covetousness. Is plain from his words, quote, who ever goes to war at his own charges? Who shepherds the flock and does not eat of the milk of the flock? 1 Corinthians 9:7. And in his desire to get hold of these things, he calls in the law. The very thing, by the way, that Paul says is dead and gone, is the tutor. God, Yahweh, didn't even give it. It was given by angels who are weak and beggarly elements. Why are you foolish Galatians keeping Sabbath anymore? Okay, that's the same guy is going to tell you, but this law you got to follow. This part of the law I want you to follow, because I'm going to tell you why. Listen, he calls in the laws as supported for his covenant, saying, or does not the law say these things? For in the law of Moses it is written that thou shalt not muzzle an ox that is treading out the corn. Verse 9. Then he adds a statement which is obscure and full of nonsense by way of cutting off the divine forethought from the brute beast, saying, does God take care of the oxen, or does he say it for our account? On our account it was written. Verse 10. And actually it says it's for our account, it was altogether written. It seems to me that in saying this, he is mocking the wisdom of the Creator, as if it contained no forethought for the things that had long ago been brought into being. For if God does not take care of oxen, pray, why is it written, he has subjected to man all things, sheep and oxen and beasts and birds and the fishes? Psalm 8, verses 8 to 9. So God ordained that mankind would take care of the animals. If God didn't love the animals, why would he hand them over to us to take care of them? Because he was using us to take care of the animals. If he takes account of fishes, much more of oxen, which plow and labor. Wherefore I am amazed at such an impostor who pays such a solemn respect to the law, because he is insatiable for the sake of getting a sufficient contribution from those who are subject to him. Yes. And the hypocrisy of it is he tells you the law is dead and gone. But here he makes one exception when it serves his own self-interest. It's so obvious, ladies and gentlemen, you're dealing with a guy who's willing to deceive you and lie to you and completely misrepresent what he believes about the law when it serves his advantage. When it's in his money, putting money in his pocket, he'll tell you the law applies. But when he knows that telling you to obey the law would repel you, you'd be like the people in Isaiah who want to hear lies. You want to hear smooth things now. He's trained you to want smooth things. But when it comes to what he really wants is your money, he's got to tell you, yeah, here's where it's a hard thing, but you must do it because it's for me, and because God's law says you have to do it. Even though I told you God's law is dead and gone, but here in this one area, you got to follow it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is so transparent. But anyway, I hope that helps some of you who are on the fence, who don't understand why Jeremy Bentham is raising this issue of how many times Paul cited versus Jesus. But it definitely tells you something's wrong in the church. When Jesus is quoted 5 times to every 23 times Paul's quoted in this, actually, these are quotes inside of this book. He's quoted 23 times to every time Jesus gets a word in, 5 times that Jesus gets a word in. That's disgusting, my friends. That is repulsive. But that's the Christianity we have today. All right, God bless. I hope that helps you. Take care. Ciao. Bye.